encourage your soul, enlighten your mind, and empower your faith. This is the Light Network. If you want to be a serious Bible student, a successful servant, and a powerful preacher, this is the podcast for you. Hello and welcome to Preachers in Training. My name is Robert Hatfield, and this is the podcast where we talk about all things preaching and ministry. On this episode, as you know, many of our episodes, if not all of them, are listener-requested topics, and that's no exception today. We're talking about ministering in funerals, and we're especially going to get into, and this is what our listener requested, the very difficult moments. There's an aspect to all funerals that are difficult, but we certainly know that some present unique challenges, and we're excited to get into that topic because of the help that we know that it'll give to all of us as preachers of the gospel. Here to help us discuss that this evening or today is Brother Barry Grider, who's joining us from the Riverbend congregation in, is it Dalton, Georgia, brother?
That is correct. Dalton,
Wonderful.
Georgia, just south of Chattanooga.
Yes. Well, welcome. And I was saying, if you're watching the video version, you will be admiring the stained glass window over Brother Grider's shoulder there. It's wonderful. Very nice.
It's very pretty and really makes you feel like you're in a sacred place, right?
That's
Doing
right.
the Lord's work, it's sacred. So
That's right. That's right.
I am very blessed that the brethren provided me a very nice study. I'm thankful for it. Appreciate you having me tonight, and appreciate the good work of the Light Network. Sure do.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. I know, Brother Grider, you've been preaching and involved in localized ministry for a good amount of time now, and also been involved, of course, with training and encouraging preachers all along the way, but especially in your time in the Memphis area. And so appreciate you very much and your willingness to come on the podcast today. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you for having me.
Every preacher will have, and we were talking about this before we began the podcast, will have the honor, but also the daunting task, the difficulty of being involved in funerals. And that is, you do sort of have to balance those two things if such a thing is a possibility. Maybe depending on where you are or the makeup of the congregation, or maybe I've even had before funeral directors call me up and say, I've got a family that needs someone to come and provide a eulogy or to preach the funeral, so to speak. And all of those things certainly are possibilities. You told me earlier you've done your fair share, maybe if not more, right?
A lot of funerals I've preached down through the years. And like I mentioned earlier to you, it is an honor to be asked to preach someone's funeral service. And this is something that I've often shared with younger preachers, that preaching a funeral is probably going to be one of your first responsibilities. And I know many times I have had students who have been in my classes who would call me and they would say, Brother Grider, we had your class. I'm just calling to talk with you a few minutes because already it's happened. I'm going to have to preach my first funeral as a local preacher. And so we'll talk about the particular situation, the person whose funeral this particular preacher is going to preach. And maybe I'll do my best to give a few more guidelines to help that preacher, be able to master his first funeral. But I think more than anything else, we preachers can help our members and anybody else who's going through the grieving process by just being present with those people who have lost loved ones. I think it's very, very important that we be there. Sometimes we want to say something and we want to be able to provide a word of comfort, and we don't have the words really to do that, particularly when someone in a family has just passed away. But the good news is we don't have to say a whole lot, because I've listened many times to families who lost loved ones. And here's what I'll hear family members saying to one another. It's never what someone had said to them during this process. It's always, did you see who was there?
Yeah.
And they will always mention various individuals who were present. So it's
Yeah.
not so much during that time what you're saying, it's just being there with, an arm around that person. And one thing I would always do with the family initially, when I get to a home and there's been a death in the family, is I will first of all embrace those family members and say, "I'm here for you. We're not there to get the invitation to preach the funeral. That may come or not come. That's up to the family.
Yeah.
We're there regardless. It may be they honor us with that. It may be other arrangements have already been made, But as a local preacher, I just want to be there with my members during this time. And I'll embrace the family members, and I never leave them unless I think that other friends, neighbors, church members are there to stay with them. I think that's important to remember, to stay there with them, because you as the preacher have got to provide a little bit of soundness of mind during that time. Those family members are grieving.
Yeah.
And usually you'll find that there'll be a family member or two that will take the lead in helping other family members through this process, but not always. And so you as the preacher have to be the stable one, the one who's in control of his emotions, even though this may be somebody that you loved dearly. That has passed away, somebody that you've known over a long period of time, maybe someone who was a great encourager to you in the congregation. But you're there to comfort, and always before you leave, pray with that family. So you may not say a whole lot, but you can always pray with them and remind them that the Lord is likewise available to comfort them. His heart hurts when their hearts hurt. And I think that helps a lot. I've never known a family, no matter how religious they may be. They may not even be a religious family. I've just been asked, for example, to come and try to comfort as a minister, but no one's ever refused prayer. Always let's go to God in prayer. And so I will leave that family in good hands, making sure there are others to help them. And I would also advise preachers to pay close attention to how many members are in a family. I can recall a situation one time where there was a brother whose wife was nearing the end of her life, and this couple had no children. The closest relative was a sister out in Utah and a niece in Nashville. And so I told this brother, I said, listen, when the time arrives, and we knew it was soon, you make sure you call me immediately. And he said, I will. And so I received a phone call from him, and he couldn't even complete the sentence. I knew exactly what had happened. His wife had passed. I said, I'll be right there. And so I arrived at the hospital, and I stayed in the room with him until the funeral home arrived, because no one else was with him. So the preacher might not always be called upon to do that, but sometimes we consider the situation, and if nobody's there to do that, to provide comfort and help during that time, then we need to step in and do it. And so at that particular time, he told me, he says, we can go on to the funeral home and make arrangements. Well, I don't typically go with the family to make arrangements. Sometimes I've gone with them. It's just, it depends on the circumstances. I did go with him. And I remember that as we were making arrangements, he had not even, picked out a casket. He never had done that before.
Right.
And he was picking out flowers and things of that nature. And I remember that because he wasn't thinking clearly, he was choosing something that he would like. I remember that none of this really looked feminine. And I mentioned to him, I said, I know why you're choosing that. That probably appeals to you, if anything about a funeral can appeal to us. But I said, keep in mind, this one here, you might consider that to be one better for a lady. He says, you're right. I didn't think about that. And it's understandable that he didn't.
Yeah.
So, you might can help a person in making decisions like that, because as much as I respect those involved in the funeral business, I've known a lot of wonderful funeral directors. but they don't want to impose much on families. It's a business. They'll do the best they can to help a family, but there's a special bond, a special relationship that exists there between the preacher and family. So
Yeah.
every situation is different. I never would say to my students that whenever you are involved with somebody going through the grieving process, this is how you always have to handle it. Use some good judgment. See who's there with the family. Now, fortunately, on that particular occasion that I just mentioned, I didn't have to preach that night. And so I called one of my elders and I said, here's the situation. I said, I'm not scheduled to preach tonight. The associate was. And he says, you just stay there and you take care of this brother.
Oh, good.
And by the time we got through making the arrangements, a couple came in that were best friends to this man and the deceased wife. And I turned this man over to them. They were going to take him out to dinner. So that's how we work together, when we're comforting people who've lost loved ones.
Yeah. When you're first beginning as a preacher, that whole funeral culture, especially maybe if you didn't grow up in a preacher's family or something, that's something you have to adjust to.
You really
do. Like you say, even some people, very few people, maybe even comparatively speaking, have been back in the area where the caskets are out on display, to help pick those out or whatever.
Yes.
And over time, you get more accustomed to that, and that helps you to be that calm and steady presence that you mentioned a minute ago. But just to remember, I don't have to say anything. I just need to be here. I need to pray. I need to try and comfort. And I've learned too that, and this was odd to me at first, just because, as I mentioned, I wasn't, so to speak, initiated into the funeral culture. But it's also not uncommon for families to joke and laugh and cut up and think about the good times as well. And sometimes that happens a split second after a very emotional and tender time. And that's all a part of grief and a part of that moment as well, isn't it?
Now, that's a good point too, because you need to pay close attention to what's happening with those family members.
Yeah.
If you get to the home and you're going to just be seated for a while and others are coming in and the family is falling apart, for example, I would always mention to my students, don't you be over here with somebody else laughing and having a good time.
Right.
But listen to the family, see their reactions, because it's very comforting to a family to begin reminiscing about special memories. And you might even have some to share. There's some funerals that I've preached where it was just not fitting at all to say anything humorous. You can understand. Yes. Sometimes it's very beneficial. And sometimes it just really does help a family as you recall events in the person's life. If it's a man or woman who's lived a long life, a full life, a godly life, then there's much to celebrate there.
Yes.
So funerals are different, and the preacher needs to be discerning, and he needs to be able to say, okay, what should my behavior be in this particular situation? But you brought up another good point too that I want to say something about, and that's having been in the actual funeral culture or in the atmosphere of the funeral home. For some of these young preachers that I've met before, they had very little knowledge of it. And I would even ask, how many of you have ever preached a funeral? Most had not. That's understandable. But it always amazed me that there were some who had never attended a funeral service.
Yes.
And I think it's important that as parents, we help our children to the best of their ability to understand that people die. We're going to live for a period of time on this earth, and then people die. And I'm thankful that my parents never kept me away from the funeral home. I learned early that death was a part of life, and it was a very familiar place to me, because if we had relatives or friends who passed away, we're going to the funeral home with mom and dad, my brother and I would.
Yeah.
And so I think that was healthy. I think it was good. And so if a young preacher's not been immersed into that, he will be quickly.
Yes.
And that's why I would oftentimes, when I was teaching a course on this, I would oftentimes schedule a time when my class could go to the local funeral home and
Oh,
just visit. And we would listen to the funeral director. And funeral directors love to have an opportunity to talk to preachers.
mm-hmm.
And we'd get some helpful information, and they would show us behind the scenes. And it would be helpful for these young preachers to know a little bit about, what's behind the curtains, that sort of thing.
Sure. Right.
I always thought that was good, and to get them comfortable in
Mm-hmm.
that kind of atmosphere. Now, I would say this: don't ever say I'm used to it,
Right.
because that's the wrong approach.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
always think about a family and try to put myself in the family's shoes. Yes, I've preached a lot of funerals. I've been to the funeral home many times. I have been behind that closed curtain where it's just the family and I and a funeral director. And I've seen those moments when it's the last viewing and the heart is breaking, and mine does too.
Yes.
And I hope it always will.
Yes.
I'm in control, but I'm touched. I never will forget a man during the closing of a service. It's the final viewing for the family. The curtains have been closed so the family can have a moment of quietness, just them and the one deceased. And an older man, I would say he was in his 80s, made his way toward the casket. He was bent over in grief. It was his 55-year-old daughter who died of cancer.
Oh.
And all I could think about was this: as a father of little girls, that was his little girl.
Yeah.
She might have been 55, and my children at the time might have been very, very young. They were very, very young. And yet, this woman who's died, that was his little girl.
Mm-hmm.
And a tear came to my eye on that moment, because if we're going to be like our Lord, and that's always our goal, then we want to be moved with compassion toward these
Right.
people.
That's right.
Because really what we're doing is we're helping people during a funeral service and before and after. We're helping those people through the most difficult time in life. And a funeral director actually told me, and I think as preachers, we could say the same thing as the funeral director. He said, I can always leave at the end of the day knowing I've helped people on the worst day of their lives, burying a loved one.
Wow.
And I think the same is true for us.
Yeah.
As we comfort people. So I always try to get to a home as quickly as possible.
Mm-hmm.
I try to be mindful of the situation in that home, see what the needs are. And we have a congregation. All of us have congregations that are willing to help. If people aren't willing to help in other areas, they are when somebody's lost a loved one, because we're compassionate people and we want to help people. And so I make sure that, whoever's in charge of food preparation, I let that person know, can you get something started?
Yes.
And then, not initially, but at some point, particularly if I'm asked to preach the funeral, I'm going to go back to the family, and I might even go with them and sit down with the funeral director as well and talk about the service that they want.
Yes.
Because sometimes the family forgets about, well, I say they forget. They probably have been in some funerals, family funeral situations before, sometimes not. But they don't always understand what's needed, because at some point, pallbearers are going to have to be selected. At some point, hymns are going to have to be selected. You have to find out eventually, am I to preach this funeral? I know there have been times when I didn't know what to say. I thought, I guess I'm supposed to preach the funeral. And in some way, a polite way, I might ask, now, who is to preach this funeral? And well, you are. Okay. I just wanted to make sure,
Glad I asked.
I'm going to help you. I'm going to help you no matter what.
Right.
I think it's very important that we let the funeral directors do their job. I've always mentioned that to preachers. Don't go to the funeral home and try to take over and do what they're qualified to do. And funeral directors, that at least the ones I've always known, are very, very helpful. Some are better than others, but they're always very, very helpful. But I'm mindful of that grieving process, and I oftentimes say to preachers, please understand that people will say things during this time that under ordinary circumstances they wouldn't.
Right.
It's not a time to preach.
Yes.
It's not a time to say to others, you don't know what you're talking about, or how dare you
Yeah.
say this, because they are going to say things that to you is going to show a lack of faith, and it's grief is what it is.
Yes. Yes.
And so initially, a family will perhaps, especially those close relatives, will be in shock,
Mm-hmm.
disbelief. There'll be anger. Grief is anger. We're
Mm-hmm.
angry that someone has been taken from us. And our work as preachers is to get them on the pathway of hope again. Before the news came, life was normal. I
Mm-hmm.
want to try to get them back to as much normalcy as possible, or at least do what I can to help
Yes.
in that process. And so
Yeah.
that's why I think it's important to be there before a funeral service and be there after a funeral service. Now,
Mm-hmm.
with regard to funeral service, we've got a generation today that I've noticed wants to get through this process and rush through it because they don't want to face death.
Right.
And let's just get this over with. You know, let's have a quick cremation, and maybe we'll have some kind of celebration service later on, and that may or may not happen. Or let's just have a graveside service. Of course, I know one
Mm-hmm.
reason for the last year and a half we've done that is because of the pandemic, and it's not
Right.
always been healthy for people to get together. But I noticed that even before that, there were a lot of people who were like, let's just get this over with. But what they
Mm-hmm.
don't realize is a funeral service, I believe, as difficult as it can be, is the beginning of restoring hope.
Right.
It helps with closure. It helps to deal with what has just happened. Many times, when a person has passed away, it's an earthquake in that person's life. And so I try to help people understand this. You may fear having to sit through a service knowing that your loved one has died. Don't
Mm-hmm.
let that be a time where you're drawn closer to God. You're comforted. You find some closure. And I think for most people, they will look back and say, "I'm glad we did that. You know, I'm glad we
Yes.
honored our loved
Yes.
one in that way." I think that's very important. And so
Mm-hmm.
I regret to see so many wanting to rush through this process today because
Mm-hmm.
it's really meant to help.
Yeah. You know, I
Um,
had a funeral director in the Charlotte area here who
mhm,
said the same thing. This was just before COVID, but he
mhm,
said, you know, we're seeing more and more cremations, fewer and
mhm,
fewer funeral services, maybe a graveside if that. And you know what I've noticed, and especially in this COVID age, what some of the funerals I've been a part of in the last 18 months plus, the person passes, maybe there's a cremation, we're going to do a memorial much later. They
mhm,
may calendar that, so there's a date for it,
mhm.
but the funeral home by that point is no longer involved. And a
Right,
lot of times it's the preacher or maybe church members
right.
who are sort of
Mhm.
stepping into more of a funeral director role as well. So
And you especially find that true when a funeral is conducted at the building. The
right.
funeral director will rely a lot on you, and so
Yes.
you many times do feel like you've become the funeral director and the preacher when it's
Hmm.
held at your building. You know,
Yeah.
because anytime that happens, and this varies. I know that in various congregations people have different roles to play, but
Hmm.
I've often found myself at the church building early on a morning when we're going to have a funeral service to make sure everything is opened up, to make sure that I'm there when
Hmm.
the funeral service arrives, the
Right.
funeral home arrives,
Yeah.
the directors and such with the body, so I can let them in and let them get started
Hmm.
with what they do. And I'll mention this too. I think this is important. Sometimes funeral directors rely on us to help them through difficult situations. And here's what I mean by that. It could be that an accident's occurred, the body is so mangled that under no circumstances can there be a viewing. And
Yeah.
yet you might have some who'll say, "Oh, I'm going to see my loved one open," and it may be that you as the preacher have to be the one to very compassionately and kindly and tenderly say, "We just can't do that." All right,
Hmm.
and help the funeral home staff in that particular way. Sometimes family members cannot let go.
Yeah.
I have been in situations before when I literally had to pry the
Mm.
hands off of a casket, and a lot of times it's guilt.
Yeah.
There are family members who have been estranged, and now all of a sudden the bad news has come, and reconciliation didn't take place. and now they're guilt-ridden, and that individual is the one that suffers the most because all these feelings of guilt are coming back again. There are also things that we don't need to say. I've heard it said even by preachers. I wouldn't make comments, and this is why I oftentimes say, just don't say a whole lot. But I've oftentimes heard preachers say, well, we wouldn't bring them back. Oh, yes, they would bring them back if they could.
Yeah, right.
So I think we have to be mindful, or things like, well, God's just ready for him. Well, that makes the person possibly think negatively about God. Did God do this? And so that's one reason I say just don't say a whole lot when this happens.
And don't you think that's particularly true in the especially difficult moments? When a child passes, when there's a car accident or something extremely sudden and unexpected, and you don't want to go in there and say, "Well, this was God's will,"
Absolutely. You don't want to be saying, God just took the prettiest flower in the garden. That's all.
Right.
Well,
right.
This is a tragedy, and already a family is questioning, why would God allow this to happen? And that's what I was saying earlier. Be prepared as preachers to hear things that you wouldn't expect out of faithful members at times, because they're grieving, and that's anger. Now, Jesus dealt with this in a wonderful way, and we have an example of it. John 11, Jesus teaches us how to handle these situations. First of all, Jesus did not leave immediately to go to Bethany because Jesus, number one, knew what he wanted to do on that occasion. But Jesus also was doing some preaching. There will be times where you and I are just not available. And I've always been so blessed to have Christian people say, look, we know you can't be here with us. You would if you could, but you're out preaching and you're doing the Lord's work. And our loved one was your biggest supporter and encourager of what you did. You just keep on preaching. You can't be here. And I always appreciate that, because I always feel really, really bad if I'm to preach a funeral and for whatever reason, I'm just totally unavailable. I just cannot be there. Yes. And I always am grateful for a family's understanding. But Jesus tarried a while. And then when Jesus arrived, he first got news that Lazarus is sick, and news was sent to Jesus from the family that Lazarus was sick. And we know what Martha said: Lord, if you'd been here, this wouldn't have happened. And I think Martha is complaining just a little bit to her Lord. She doesn't like it that he was not there. If you'd been here, this would not have happened. And yet I know that our Lord did not scold Martha on that occasion. He loved Martha. He understood how that she was grieving, and Mary was grieving. And it's interesting to me what Jesus talked about. And I think this is a good instruction for those of us who are gospel preachers. Jesus talked about his resurrection, didn't he? And that's where we go to for hope, is that empty tomb. Yes. And I noticed the emotions of Jesus. He goes to the grave of Lazarus, and for whatever reason, and there's a lot of speculation as to why he did this, but Jesus wept. He knew how to weep with others, and he calls upon us to weep with those who weep. And so there's tenderness in our Lord, and we see that he was there when people went through this grieving process. And he didn't raise everybody from the dead, but he did raise Lazarus from the dead. And now, because he raised Lazarus from the dead, and because he himself came forth from the dead, I've got a message of hope I can offer.
Yes. Yeah.
And so when I think about the actual funeral service, and I'm asked sometimes, Brother Grider, what do you say? Well, one thing we can always say is, we have a Savior, and he was raised from the dead. And he said, because I live, you shall live also. And so I always try to think about the risen Savior. I think about passages that speak of his coming again. And it's amazing to me what will comfort and what will not. You can talk about a lot of things that, people may find pleasurable and things of that nature, but that doesn't mean it offers comfort at the grave. The Psalm 23 will, and John 14, 1-3, that'll work. And 1 Thessalonians 4, 13, following, that'll work, and that will help people. And You mentioned something earlier too. I wanted to say something about this, and that is being called upon by a local funeral director
Yeah.
to preach a service because a family doesn't have a preacher. Now we're going to find that more and more, I think,
Yes.
and that makes this an evangelistic outreach.
Mm-hmm.
Because there are more and more people out there today who don't have a preacher. They don't have a church home. We oftentimes talk about the secularization of our society and a lot of irreligious people out there. Um, but I know this, there's a vacuum in man that only God can fill. And you know that's
Mm-hmm.
true,
Mm-hmm.
Robert. And that's what we're trying to help people find and help them discover that. Because I think there are a lot of people as they're getting older, they start asking, well, what if there is a God? And maybe there is, maybe I do have a soul. And is there an afterlife? And I say, focus a lot on senior adult ministry because there are a lot of
Mm.
people getting old today who have wasted their lives, but it's not too late.
Wow.
And then, we get these calls from a funeral director. It could be that a family has some kind of connection to the Lord's church, maybe, maybe not, but for whatever reason, the funeral director says, I need your help.
Yeah.
And so we go and we meet the family, and I'm asked, well, what do you do during that time? Well, I try to find out as much information as I can of the loved one. I've always found that there's something positive you can find in most people's lives.
Yes.
And people appreciate when you can say something positive, about their loved one.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm going to try to find out something about the member of the family that, I probably will find the member of the family that is the most congenial and seems to be in control of feelings. I say, tell me about your relative, tell me about,
Mm-hmm.
I want to talk about him. I want to talk about her. But then it also provides me an opportunity to point this family in the right direction. Obviously,
Mm.
we can't preach somebody into heaven. We're not there to do that. We
Right.
don't want to say something that's false or give false hope, but I can at least point the living toward Christ and toward God's
Yes.
word. And that's what I've always tried to do in those situations is to
Mm-hmm.
try to comfort a family in that way, and then tell them who I am and tell them
Mm-hmm.
where I preach and that I would like to stay in touch. And sometimes no interest is really shown. Appreciation usually is shown, but as far as
Yes.
follow-up interest, that's usually not shown. But you never do know. It might
Right.
open the door of opportunity for you, that could result in people becoming Christians. Because I have
Mm-hmm.
known people before who did have some kind of connection with the church, particularly, and now all of a sudden, hey, this is an earthquake. This is a time to get right
Right.
with God.
Right.
And we appreciate you being here with us. And where do you preach? Well, I'll tell you
Yes.
where I preach. Come and join us and be with us. That's it.
Yeah. And I found too that sometimes whether the you may plant a seed, right, that doesn't
Mhm.
germinate and sprout
Oh,
until
yeah.
much later. And then
That's right.
also there are people that may be attending that funeral who
Yes.
may also be
Yes.
influenced by. And I've had opportunities to be a part of other funerals just
Yeah.
because I preached another funeral that somebody was just there.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, we never do know what doors of opportunity God's going to open for us.
Right.
And
Right.
that's why we have to always keep this in mind.
Mm-hmm.
Little as much when God is in it, we
Yeah.
sometimes sing, we sometimes say, and that's true. I mean, what may seem like just an hour out of our day to go help somebody
Mm-hmm.
could be life changing for somebody. Because
Yeah.
I've often mentioned, there are earthquakes in people's lives that really cause them to start thinking about the spiritual.
Mm.
Sometimes there are good things that happen, such as a couple gets married and they start thinking, hey, let's start our married life off right by getting right with the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes I've counseled with couples who are going to get married. One of them, the young man, young lady, one's not a member of the church, and so we
Yeah.
also have a time to study the Bible and see if we can maybe persuade him to obey the gospel before the couple gets married. Because I would obviously, to the Christian in that situation, I would say, you really need to marry a Christian. Let's see if we can study the Bible with this one in whom you're in
Yes.
love, and so that can begin something good. Then you
Mhm.
might have a couple that's become wayward. Now they're having a baby. Well, that's a good
Yes.
time for me to go to them and say, hey, this baby's coming, and you want that baby to be in Bible classes. You need to be in worship. Give that baby good foundation. It's just good time to help. The other, though, is when tragedy strikes.
Yeah.
And, when something, a death occurs in a family, and it could be that, a faithful member of the church dies, and they have, faithful member of the church has some unfaithful children. And all of a sudden, I want to see Daddy when this life is over with, and it's time for me to get right. So as the preacher, you want to take advantage of those kind of situations too.
Yeah. I've found that this is this is a hunch I have, and I think I've confirmed it in my mind. I want to see if you agree with this, that people, it's like you said earlier about when you're at the person's home, they often don't remember what you say. They just remember you were there, you were gentle with them, you were available to minister to them, you prayed with them. And to me, I think it's the same way with the funeral service itself. I think that I find that people don't necessarily remember specifically what I said, that some may, in rare circumstances. They remember I was there. They remember I was kind. Remember I was gentle and compassionate. And that, from sort of the inside perspective, as we're talking to preachers, that helps me to take a little bit of the pressure off.
Yes.
I mean, I want to, people will certainly remember if I say the wrong thing. I don't want to do that. But that helps me particularly in really difficult times. And, sometimes when I'm talking with people and there are just no words, and I know that they're kind of waiting on me to say, sometimes I just say, boy, I wish I could speak a right word and comfort your heart. But all I know to do is pray. What do you think?
And they appreciate that so very much. And I said earlier, we've got to be in control of our emotions. I don't want to say that in a way that we don't show any emotion. There have been moments before when I've preached a funeral that my voice would break because whoever this is, I just loved this person. It was a member of the church, maybe. I'm sure it was, who was very much an encourager of mine. We had a close relationship through the years.
Yes.
And that family, appreciates that, because what it says to the family is, my preacher loved my loved one. My preacher loves us, and he's hurting too. And it's genuine. It comes from the heart. And I know I can't just break down and lose control because I'm in control of that service. But there's nothing wrong with shedding a tear and crying with folks. There's nothing wrong with your voice breaking, because you too have been touched by death. Death is mean. It's vicious. And there's nothing about death I like. But I think what is so wonderful about our God is he is able to take that which is so hideous as death, and yet he can turn that into our greatest victory. That's the vehicle. That's the door through which we must go to be with him. Only God can do that,
That's wonderful.
And so I read 1 Corinthians 15, where it says, death is going to be swallowed up in victory. And what I'm learning now, I'll be 57 tomorrow. So I know I'm past midlife. I was moving along. It just seemed like yesterday I was holding youth rallies, and here I am almost 60. But I do know that, when I think about that passage, death will be swallowed up in victory. And I'm like, as I look around me today, this thing called death, it's the great swallower upper, I call it. It's swallowing everybody I love.
Yes.
And so I love that passage, that death's going to be swallowed up finally when Jesus comes again. And so those are things we can talk about and encourage people, before a service, during a service, and after a service. I encourage preachers, particularly in the local congregation, go back quite regularly and check on the family. Because oftentimes the reality of the death sets in after the funeral. And family members start having to go back to work and go back to where they live. And, particularly if you have a widower, you and your wife, be mindful as, such a person. And I've often said to family members who live far away, I'm like, look, my wife and I will be checking on your mother, on your dad, and we'll get them out of the house. and we'll encourage them. And so your work's not over after the funeral. And it's a wonderful work to be involved. I mean, you really are helping people during the most difficult times of their lives, and they don't ever forget that. You mentioned something too, and I don't want our time to get away from us without us talking about this: the various kinds of funerals.
Yes.
Kinds of funerals. What I would do in my classes is I would. It was somewhat entertaining, but because it would be by the draw, I would have all these different various types of funerals, and along with that, in that same course, I would teach not just funerals, but also how to perform wedding ceremonies, and then special occasion type of messages.
Yes.
So go around the room, everybody, oh my, look at the people's faces like, can't believe I got this one, And so I would always say this. I said, if you have recently experienced a death in your family and this is heavy on your mind, then you trade with somebody. I don't want to put that on a person when that's happened, but I would have different types of funerals. By different types, I mean, by age, a child, a teenager in an accident, an old man, old woman, both Christians, or somebody middle-aged, a non-Christian. How do you preach these types of funeral services?
Yes.
And so I think that with regard to a child, that's the most difficult. Now, no one is more prepared to leave this earth to be with the Lord than a little child. We know the child is safe, but that's not normal, for a child to die. That's not how it's supposed to be.
Yes.
And no parent is ready for that. And I think during those occasions, that more than any other occasion, you're just there. I think it's good for you and your wife to be there because of the tender motherly affection that a wife can have, on that couple, and maybe on other children or siblings, And I think that's very, very important. And I would remind the audience and, of course, the family, as I'm preaching a funeral service for a little child, how much our Lord loved children and how there will be a reunion day with these children, And then there's the tragedy of for example, a teenager involved in an accident. Now, here's going to be your opportunity to preach, and I do mean preach to a lot of young people. When I say you're standing there preaching, you're telling them about Christ. You're telling them about God's plan for their lives, and you talk about this person that they love, this young person, and you talk about how we can't explain what happened and why these things happen.
Yes.
But there's an opportunity where you can really grab hold of the minds of some young people, some of whom need to rethink how they're living, and realize that we all are going to be held accountable before God. And so I think I'd take advantage of that opportunity that you have, because there's going to be a whole lot of friends there. I've preached services before of teenagers where you had a 100, 200 fellow classmates there.
Wow.
And a lot of these kids aren't used to going to a church service,
Yes.
And so here you have an opportunity to try to reach them. And if you have opportunity to spend some private time with some of them, it's good, because I can recall a time in my life when I was a teenager and a friend or an acquaintance my age would die, and that's traumatic.
Yes.
Because that sometimes is our first experience with death, and it's one of our own. And my son went through that with a dear friend of his a few years ago. We had to help Kason through that period, because this was a dear friend, and just the shock of it all. Yes. There's funeral services, for a non-Christian. How do you handle that? Well, I can't stand before an audience and preach him into heaven and say everything was all right. But what I always can find are good things about his life, and reflect on those things, because at least a man deserves to have the good things pointed out. He's a good neighbor, good friend, good daddy, good husband.
Yes. Yeah.
And so I do that, and then I will turn the attention of the family toward things that are biblical. I might even say something like, here's what he would want for your life. Here's what he would want you to do. He would not want you to give up. He'd want you to press forward.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure he would want you to love one another. I'm sure he would want you to read your Bible and follow God's word. So those are some things that can be said. And then really, in most instances, when you have a Christian who's died, be it a man or a woman, on up in years, it's usually a joyful occasion, because
Mm-hmm.
we realize the time is coming when we will have to leave this earth, and it's just a part of life, and we've got to prepare for it and be ready for it. And so that's when we can really talk about the great victory, that we have in Christ, and we remember a life well lived. But then also, I try to take the audience beyond that, to those passages where God speaks through His Word about the victory that awaits us. Revelation 21. Great
Mm-hmm.
chapter. God's going to wipe away all tears. I mentioned 1 Corinthians 15 earlier. What a chapter that is to help us during these particular times.
Yes.
And so you want every family, no matter how traumatic the experience is, to leave with at least just a little hope
Mm-hmm.
that life's still worth living. And that it may take a while to get back to some sense of normalcy, but with God's help, we can do it.
Mm.
Yeah.
That is, I'm so grateful for the way you just walked us through that and helped us too with some, practically, here's some passages you could turn to. Here are some things that you could say to comfort. And really, we're ministering to these families, and not just in the moment of the funeral, the hour or whatever for that one time, but before, as you said, the funeral, from the point of the death until that memorial service, and then even after that too. And to follow
After, particularly, you need to let these people talk,
Ah,
because it may be at that time these people are ready to talk.
yeah.
And I remember that one particular lady, and these were not members of the church; they were religious people,
Mm.
but they were friends to my parents. And I remember this happened about 30 years ago. The father in this family, took his life.
Oh,
And that shocked all of us. We
yeah.
did not realize the depression he evidently was experiencing.
Mm.
And I remember that my mother and I were conversing with his widow. And she said this. She says, right now, I'm so angry with him. Like, why did you do this to me?
Yes.
Those are natural feelings that come.
Yes.
She says, she goes, one day, oh, how I miss you. I want you back. Then another day, why would you do this to us? We needed you here. So, all of these various feelings, overwhelm a person.
Yeah.
And this is another subject, but I'll bring it up right here. There are a lot of times family members that are estranged from one another. And sometimes the bickering and the feuding, it's just painful to watch.
Mm-hmm.
And that may be when you're called upon sometimes to step in also. And I was involved in a situation like that not long ago. One family member just, if this sibling shows up, I'm not going to be there. I'm going to walk out. No, you can't do that.
Yes.
This is about your dad.
Yeah.
This is to honor him, and you're not honoring him by doing that.
Right.
And so sometimes you have to be, as a preacher, rather blunt about those things. You love your mom or your dad, but you've got this situation that you can't get along with a sibling. You're going to have to overcome that for just a little while. And why not? Let's work on getting that worked out, and that would please your parents more than anything else.
Mm-hmm.
You do take a little bit of time to preach, I guess, in some way to family members. We're always preachers, no matter what we.
That's right.
What we do. But I do like to press the point with younger preachers: don't ever be shocked by what you hear, and
Mm.
don't think at that particular time is when you need to correct it, because it's not. I heard a story that I've often shared this with preachers and others, and I'm not about to try to act like I have insight into um, the eternal destinies of
Mm.
the great Roy Rogers and Dale Evans. I think they were very religious people, and certainly they were great entertainers. And I wish we had more in Hollywood today like them. But Roy and Dale adopted a lot of children
Mm.
during their lives and gave them a good home. And they loved those children like their own.
Mm.
And one of those children died. And of course, it just was a painful situation. And Roy particularly had trouble as a boy, and it was very difficult for him. And Roy said to Dale, "Why would God do this to us?" And Dale said, "Now, Roy, you can't think that way. You can't think that way." He said, God's been good to us, and God's son died on the cross, and he understands all of this." And so Roy went on about his business. And later on, some months later, Roy and Dale were driving out there in Southern California, out around the mountains and in a somewhat isolated area, and they were just enjoying the day. And Roy started talking about all the blessings, how God had been so good to them. And Dale said, "And you remember a few months ago, Roy, you was ready to give up on God because we lost that son and all that." Roy said, "Well, yeah, I know it." He said, "But God knew I didn't mean it."
Uh,
And I like that, because
yes.
when we're grieving, there are a lot of things we might say, but our merciful and compassionate God knows we
Mm.
don't mean it. And
Wow.
nobody's touched more than he's touched.
Yeah.
And I'll share this scripture because I think it's a good one. And that's 2 Corinthians 1, 3, and 4, where we read
Mhm.
about God is Father of mercies, the God of all comfort. And I
Mhm.
rarely preach a funeral service that I don't use that passage. But then in the next verse, paraphrasing somewhat, he comforts us in all of our troubles so we
Yes.
can turn around and comfort those who don't have what we have.
Yes.
And there's so many people we'll minister to them that don't have what we have, that
Mm.
don't call upon God, don't depend on God, don't have a relationship with him. So he comforts us so we can turn around and comfort everybody else and point them in
Wow.
this direction.
Yeah. Wow. Those are great thoughts.
Yeah.
Um, let's maybe we'll have some parting exhortations or the final words here in just a moment to the preachers who are listening to this. And while we do that, for just a moment, before we do that, I want to take a moment to let you know that Preachers in Training is brought to you by the Light Network, a network of Christian podcasts designed to encourage your soul, enlighten your mind, and empower your faith. You can find episode archives of this podcast and all of the others that are under the umbrella of the Light Network on our website at thelightnetwork.tv. We love to hear from you, and we frequently do, and we're so grateful about that. If you have an episode idea, something you'd like us to address in the future, send an email to preachers@thelightnetwork.tv. That'll come directly to me. We'll put that in the pool, so to speak, for future episodes, and we're always working to schedule the episodes into the future. As well, you can contact us in our Facebook group. Just go to Facebook and then the search bar, type in Preachers in Training. You'll find a group there. It's a closed group. We keep it closed just to make sure that the folks in there are, in fact, preachers or ministers serving the local congregations in some ways. And we do tailor our conversations specifically to that topic. And if you're interested in continuing the conversation or polling, the several hundred people who are part of that group, we often do things like that, and that's a wonderful resource. We want you to be a part of it if you're interested in doing that. If you enjoy the podcast, you can subscribe in your favorite podcast app. Just search Preachers in Training or The Light Network and hit that subscribe button so you never miss an episode. And video version is available as well on YouTube. Type in Preachers in Training or The Light Network or my name, Robert Hatfield. All those places will take you ultimately to the same YouTube channel. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss an episode. Brand new episodes of Preachers in Training release every Thursday from thelightnetwork.tv and all of those channels as well. Sure am grateful for the topic that's been suggested to us for this episode, ministering in funerals. And I sure am grateful to you, Brother Grider, for sharing your insights and your wisdom and imparting that to us and challenging us and encouraging us. What would you like to say as we sort of close things down and
Well,
land the plane, so to speak.
I hope it has been beneficial.
It has.
We
Yes.
bounced around tonight looking at different aspects of funerals. I really do believe that it can be one of your greatest works in the local congregation, ministering to people who are hurting and who are grieving. And of course, sometimes there's a long process. You know, a person is sick for a long time.
Yes.
And I would suggest that preachers, to the extent they can these days, be involved in visitation and realize how important it is to sit at the hospital. You don't have to be the only member sitting at the hospital, but I think if possible, when this pandemic is behind us, and I trust it will be one day, and we can get back to ministering like we once did, to sit at the side of those who were very sick. That is certainly a compassionate thing to do, and we're to be the most compassionate individuals on earth as preachers. I sometimes have heard it expressed like this: I love to study the Bible and love to preach, but I don't really care about visiting. I don't care about being around people. But I think it's very difficult for us to adequately preach the gospel if we don't have some desire to be with people. Preaching is a people business, and there has to be proper balance to that. Of course, we need to spend some time in our studies and be well prepared when we preach. And of course, there's so many aspects of preaching, different situations where we can preach, and there's some preaching involved in regard to the funeral process. But it helps these people get through the difficult times knowing a preacher cares. And I think it's very important for a young man coming out of preaching training school to find a place where he can serve. Just find a place where you can serve. And if you can find a congregation, may have 50, 75 people, maybe somewhat small, but that's 50, 75 people you can serve and you can help and you can encourage on a path that will ultimately end in heaven. And what if all we influence for heaven 50, 75 people? I mean, that's 50, 75 souls. And that's important. And if we do what the Lord wants us to do, we'll influence a whole lot more than that. But let me just say, it's been a privilege to be with you tonight, Robert. I appreciate you and all the brethren that are working in the Gospel Light Network. Did I say that right?
The Light Network. Yes,
Light
sir.
Network. The Light. I know you preach the gospel. It's the Light Network. The gospel is the light.
The gospel's in there too. Absolutely.
The gospel's in there too. I'm a generation, I guess, ahead of some of you fellas, but I'm so proud of you and glad I can be working and serving in the kingdom at the same time. Some of you that I have actually witnessed come of age, and you're doing a great job in helping people and saving souls, and I know the Lord is pleased. Appreciate all
thank you so much. We appreciate you so much as well, and so grateful for your time this evening. We've said this evening, I don't know when you're listening to this, but we're recording this in the evening time, and so I'm appreciative, brother, of your carving out some time for us and sacrificing in that way too. That means
you
a lot.
Notice behind me, this stained glass is now dark, isn't
it? Isn't it?
So here you're in the Eastern time zone, and so am I. It's already dark. So
I tell the other time zones we're living in the future, so the future is good.
That's right. This is the first time I grew up around Chattanooga. This is not far from my home, but I grew up on the other side of Chattanooga where it's Central Time. This is the first time in my life I've ever lived in Eastern Time Zone, and I'm not sure after 2.5 years if I'm used to it yet.
It takes time that news at 11. That's a hard one to get used to. But
anyway. Fortunately for me, we would get Chattanooga television stations when I was growing up as a boy. And they would say, coming up tonight at 11. And I knew that meant 10 our time. So,
that's right.
So I did experience that, which most people don't have to do that, but we did,
Oh, that's wonderful. I want to thank you as well for being a part of this episode today. And I hope that it's been a benefit to you as it has been to me who are listening. And we're so grateful again to you, Brother Griner, as well. Join us again next week. Michael Haidt joins us from Bear Valley Bible Institute of Denver to talk about Logos some more. He was here not long ago to discuss that topic, and you all wrote in and said, more of that, please. And so Michael Haidt will join us next week. That's coming next Thursday, the Lord willing, from BeLightNetwork.tv. Until then, thanks for being with us today. I'm Robert Hatfield. Let's go preach the word.